Hello, welcome to Lecture 11 in SOCO 3666, Consumption in Everyday Life. And today I'll be looking at globalisation, consumerism and inequality, mostly at a more global level than the inequalities we've looked at that have tended to be more national level stuff throughout the course so far. So I'll be looking at Zygmunt Bauman's work in the second part of the lecture that I think is particularly interesting for for thinking about some of the problems from a sociological perspective. And in the third part, I'll be looking at some other conceptual devices to think about global inequalities as well. But in the first part, I'll be just kind of sketching out some of the issues that I'm talking about. So I'm talking about global inequalities here, particularly between what we call the North and the South, what we kind of, I think, erroneously call the developed and the developing world. I think a better way to put it sometimes would be the minority world, which would refer to the West, and the majority world that refers to the rest in terms of these huge global inequalities that I'm going to talk about now. But to begin with, I've just put in some examples here of some interesting examples of inequalities within nation states, in Australia in particular, and this is a kind of, again, an effort to make the normal look strange here. This is reported on a year or two ago where it was kind of highlighted the way that our energy system works. It seems that more poor people tend to be the ones that are subsidising the use of air conditioners by more privileged people. So there's you can click on that and have a read of that story there. And there's also a link to a story that was on Four Corners a few years ago about what it's like to live in poverty in Australia. But the inequalities I'm going to focus upon mostly in this lecture is global inequalities. So again, a kind of attempt to make the normal look strange here. The Danny Dorling's Worldmapper project is really interesting. You should click and have a look at some of those maps, where he uses kind of spatial representations and geography and distorts maps of the world to represent various statistical inequalities throughout the globe. So again, please just briefly pause and have a look at that. So the lecture today is about inequalities on a global scale. And it kind of, I suppose, continues on from the previous lecture that was thinking about how notions of the economic and globalisation issues around consumption systems lead to huge environmental problems and waste and stuff like that. So today, moving from those environmental costs to thinking more about the human costs in particular. And as the analyses of these kind of huge global inequalities point out, that for many people in the world, the huge amount of wealth and access to shiny consumer products is only for a kind of minority of the people in the world. For many people in the world, life is still, as Thomas Hobbes pointed out centuries ago, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. So in this sense, again, I want to critically interrogate the notions of civilization and progress that are embedded in what we call the developed world and our attitudes towards economics and exchange and value and efficiency. And show how, many sociologists and more radical economists argue that it's these systems that are actually the cause of global problems like that and cannot be the fix of them. Underneath these systems is the very notion of violence. As Weber pointed out a century or two ago, that governments tend to be the people that hold the means of legitimate violence. So I'm going to look at notions of violence of that in the the third part of today's lectures, and particularly around Zizek's notion of systemic violence. But we're all very familiar with these figures, I think, and I've used a quote there from Ulrich Beck, but you're kind of familiar with the various billion people living on less than $1 a day, and half the world's population hasn't made a phone call and stuff like that. As Beck points out there, the poorest 1.2 billion, 1/5 of the world population, are responsible for just 1.3% of the world's consumption, 4% of its energy supplies, and 1.5% of all telephone connections. So it's kind of easy in many ways to represent global inequality through and the suffering that this produces through figures. But I personally, and many others, from a more qualitative sociological perspective, have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with these stats, in the sense that in many ways, by representing inequality through the use of stats, you're kind of almost, reusing the very dominant economic logic itself. And the idea that if these figures improve, then lives will necessarily improve. Now, that's not to say that the case of that won't be the case, but as I was talking about in the last lecture, measurements of GDP and things like that tend to distort the reality of inequalities in general, and certainly don't take into account notions of happiness and satisfaction and that kind of thing. So the kind of understanding that if we improve GDP, that it'll improve the kind of happiness and satisfaction of everyone, that kind of trickle-down effect, is heavily criticised from many disciplines, really. Sociology, this social psychology that criticises it well, and within economics, that these average figures distort reality, that regardless of the figures themselves in terms of GDP, inequalities within nation states seem to matter a lot. And you can see the work of the Spirit level, around the Spirit level in particular there, but others like Clive Hamilton and Danny Dorling and Raj Patel also talk about that kind of stuff. And, also that, just relying on figures tends to kind of hide or nullify the actual human consequences. The balance sheets and stuff like that don't really represent. So some people argue that much of our kind of global system today is based on a class system that's like almost a trickle-up effect, where there's a kind of very wealthy, very privileged transnational class that relies on the exploitation of literally billions of people around the globe.